This session, we have Dr. David Baker from East Sydney Doctors presenting on alcohol and other drug use, including medicinal cannabis.
So I've just called this good drugs, bad drugs. And of course, this is a subjective description. I'm also dialing in from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I'm paying my respects to Aboriginals, leaders, present and past, and future. So I'm a GP at East Sydney Doctors, lecturer at Notre Dame, and as a disclosure, I've been involved in a number of pharma studies, not really in the area of drug and alcohol. So the main topics tonight, some of the changing ideas about drug use, some new uses for old drugs, and also a focus on medicinal or medical cannabis. And we'll go through these now. So the word drug is really any medicine or substance which has a physiological effect when ingested or otherwise introduced into the body. So of course, it's a very broad term. It includes things like the caffeine in your tea and coffee. And of course, most drugs that most people are ingesting are particularly legal, prescribed, sometimes with restrictions, for instance, on nicotine and alcohol. And then there are illegal drugs. And this, of course, is constantly changing. And that's, again, up to the legal system and Parliament to decide what drugs are legal and what are not legal. And then the concept of illicit drugs, which includes illegal drugs. And also some prescription medicine that has been obtained illegally or has been used for non-medical purposes, such as opioid tablets, painkillers that are diverted, and also some other substances such as glue or paint thinner that people inhale. This is quite an old idea, but I think it's still extremely helpful. And I think this is the idea of the drug use spectrum. And there's various forms of this, but it really recognizes that all humans use drugs of various sorts. And these can be quite beneficial, such as the coffee we have in the morning, perhaps to get us going. And then the idea of also social use, such as low risk use, say having a beer with your friends after work, possibly having a joint on Friday night. So we regard these as low risk use. And then we probably all of us have had the experience of a higher use situation, such as binge drinking, drinking too much, getting into trouble, hopefully not smashing up your car. So these are higher risk use. And unfortunately, certain drugs like heroin, for instance, is very dangerous in the higher risk situation because it can lead to an opiate overdose, which can be fatal. And then on to the term addiction or substance use disorder or drug dependency happens with some drugs and alcohol. And this involves, the key issue is compulsion. So it's where a drug or alcohol or other substance takes on a central part of our life, and the idea it rules our life. And this also it's largely psychological, the compulsion, and the physical side of addiction or dependency is tolerance, where we need more and more of the substance, and withdrawal. So if we stop whatever it is, we feel physiological withdrawal. So this is particularly common with opioids, where withdrawal is very unpleasant, and also with alcohol withdrawal, which potentially is dangerous because of convulsions and such like. So this is, I think, an extremely useful diagram, which probably many people have seen something like this. This is actually from Wikipedia, but this is looking at all drugs and alcohol on two axes. One is the likelihood of harm. So up there we have heroin because of sometimes the first time someone uses heroin is that they die. So heroin's inherently very toxic. And you could add to this a lot of, obviously now we've got fentanyl in the US. Fortunately, fentanyl, which is a very strong opiate, hasn't really reached Australia, which is very fortunate. And also prescribed opiates in overdose can be extremely dangerous. And then we've got dependency on their other axis. So we look at opiates as being highly addictive, or they tend towards dependency. And then we move down to things at the other end of the spectrum. It would be very rare for someone to become addicted to LSD, for instance. And we see that drugs like even ecstasy, MDMA, considered relatively safe and unlikely to cause dependency. Whereas a lot of prescribed drugs, such as benzodiazepines, things like Valium, are quite high risk for dependency, and also quite risky in overdose, because anything that shuts your breathing down can be highly risky if it's combined with other things such as alcohol. And another extremely useful diagram that people may have seen, this from a Lancet paper from a few years ago, but you see this all over the place. This is from a study in the UK, and given that we are just largely descendant of people from the UK, we have a similar interest in alcohol. So we can see that in the UK, alcohol is considered the most harmful medicine or drug. And this is made up of harm to the person, such as damage to the liver, and then also harm to the community from alcohol. This is quite relevant at the moment because there's a lot of talk about domestic violence, which is often fueled by alcohol use. And also obviously car smashes and other accidents, like Friday Night and Casualty, a lot of it's from alcohol, of course. And then next down the list is heroin. I was working around in the 90s when unfortunately we lost a lot of people from heroin addiction, heroin overdose. This is not quite as common now. Then crack cocaine is not really an issue in Australia, down to amphetamines, I shall talk a little bit more about, and then tobacco. So fortunately, tobacco use has dropped right off, but tobacco use is mostly a danger to the person themselves. And we go down the list. We might move on. But in Australia, fortunately, all governments have been quite supportive of the notion of harm reduction. And this is saying, well, we accept humans use drugs, and the health system wants to provide support to make drug use safer. So that's where we encourage people to smoke rather than inject, where there's an option, for instance, with crystal, smoking is safer than injecting. And then switching to safer drugs. So over many years, we've had opioid substitution therapy, where we offer long-acting versions of heroin, such as methadone and buprenorphine, because these are safer than continuing to use heroin. And also the fascinating issue about nicotine vapes versus cigarettes, which is a very hot topic at the moment. We'll talk a bit more about, and a needle and syringe exchange. And it's great that these ideas really have bipartisan support, unlike, say, the crazy Americans. So moving on to drug treatment, there's again a lot of interesting issues here. We've got really medications, and I think it's really helpful to think of medications used for drug and alcohol use. There's the idea of something that mimics what you're using. This is called an agonist. So this is mostly very well known in terms of heroin. So people who are using heroin, we offer them agonist therapy like methadone, which is very similar effect, but it has a long half-life, so it can be dosed once a day. And the idea of partial agonist, which is something similar, but also a blocking agent, and we've got buprenorphine, which fortunately now comes in a 1 month injection, so we can give people a depot of buprenorphine, and then they really won't use heroin at all. And they'll feel quite comfortable. So these are, we've got agonists and antagonists as a blocker. And these aren't used that much. We've got anti-craving medicines, mostly used in alcohol. And then the one and only, something called aversive therapy is anti-abuse, which means it's only used with alcohol. So if people are really struggling not to drink, some people take anti-abuse, and that means if they have a drink, they'll feel sick. And that really approaches, it's the only place in medicine where that type of treatment is used. Support groups can be very helpful. The 12-step AA model has been very, very good for some people. And now there's a slightly newer version, or smart recovery, which is more cognitive behavioral therapy based. And that suits some people a lot better. And then obviously counseling, psychology, and inpatient care for withdrawal and rehabilitation, which can be very helpful in certain situations. This is a key approach to just about everything, is a readiness to change model. And I think individuals use this themselves, and certainly all healthcare services are built around this model. Sometimes thought to be like traffic lights. For instance, someone may say, I'm a smoker, I enjoy my smoking, I don't want to stop. So there's no point in trying to encourage them to stop smoking if they don't want to. So that's red light. Some people are a bit interested in stopping smoking, for instance, and that's sort of an orange light. And then green light, someone who really wants to make a serious attempt. If people are very keen to stop smoking, for instance, we can offer various medicines that can be helpful. And I think someone earlier mentioned alcohol. I mean, the issues about alcohol are really very interesting, and I call this the new bad drug. So unfortunately, elderly doctors usually like drinking red wine, and quite often own vineyards, I found out. And they're very wedded to the idea that a few glasses of red wine every night is actually very helpful. And this was unfortunately very much wishful thinking, because it's turned out that alcohol is not really a very safe drug after all. And the main concern really is that even small amounts of alcohol are associated with increased risks of cancer, which is very disappointing. So we used to think there was a threshold level for alcohol where 2 or 3 drinks a day is fine. And that's what the national guidelines still say in Australia. For men, it's about 2 drinks a day, women about 1 drink a day. And again, everyone has to make up their own mind about this if they want to keep drinking. I've really been quite amazed at 20-somethings really often aren't drinking very much anymore, which is quite interesting. It's a huge worry for the alcohol industry, of course. And so when we think about drinking, whether we go for a controlled drinking model saying alcohol's fine, just switch over to light drinks, say low alcohol beer or something like that, and just keep it at, say, 2 units a day. And that works very well for some people. Other people really, that model won't work, and they have to really switch to an abstinence model, which is saying, I have to not drink at all. To give people some assistance, there are some anti-craving medicines like naltrexone or camprosate, which they're very much hit and miss, trial and error. Sometimes they can be helpful, other times they don't help. And then we come back to our briefly mentioned anti-abuse, which is aversive therapy. And then we've got support groups like Smart Recovery and AA, which can be great. Now, I'm always fascinated by the reappearance of what I say are now good bad drugs. So ketamine, which is actually an anesthetic, that is being a bit of a party drug. People take it to go down the K-hole, and it's now used for severe depression and Australia has actually led the world in licensing MDMA and psilocybin. So MDMA has been licensed for post-traumatic stress disorder and psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. And Australia was the first country in the world that did this, which is quite remarkable. But these are still highly restricted drugs, and only a few doctors are currently prescribing them. But I think it's fascinating that finally, because of course MDMA was originally developed by a pharma company and was used for relationship therapy, which I think is quite fascinating because obviously in Sydney it was used a lot for relationship therapy in the 80s and 90s. So we'll see more of this in the future. Bad drug, tobacco, but of course nicotine itself is actually quite safe. Clearly smoking tobacco is very bad, and especially bad if you're living with HIV, because smoking is a very pro-inflammatory. And I think you had an interesting talk recently about inflammation from a doctor from Melbourne. So we're very keen for people not to smoke. And now this brings up the issue about vapes. So Australia has millions of vapes floating around from all over the world with what's in the vapes, we often have no idea, because most vapes are made in China, along with everything else. But quite often they can have contaminants in them. So the government over the last 3 years has been busy banning vapes completely unsuccessfully. Because now that's tobacco costs, cigarettes cost about $40 a packet. Of course, now there's a massive black market in cigarettes and tobacco. So I think 30% plus of cigarettes in Australia are actually tax-free and bought under the counter. And similar with vapes, about 3 years ago, they said, oh, we're banning vapes and we're going to train all of the GPs in the country to prescribe medical vapes. And even though I did the training and got the license, over the next few years, I've only had like 3 or 4 people a year coming in wanting a medical vape. So it's a joke. And I don't know if this year will be any different from previous years. So we're trained and ready and waiting. But when I've tried to prescribe these, it's quite hard to find a pharmacy that will even stock medical vapes. These are ones that are tested and safe for people to use. So I think it's a very hot topic at the moment. And I'll be very interested to see what happens in the future. Bad drug heroin, we've talked a bit about that. It unfortunately can be highly lethal. We can also add in medical opiates, which also can be very bad. I guess some people may have seen Dope Sick, which I thought was a great story from America. And that's streaming at the moment. That's certainly a really good story about how America messed up opiates so badly. And that the terrible behavior of pharma industry in doing that. We had a bit of that in Australia in the 90s from that same company, but fortunately we didn't go down as low as the Americans in terms of the disaster of medical opiates, but it's still a big problem. The crystal, again, is complicated because amphetamines do have a therapeutic use for ADHD. And attention deficit hyperactivity is becoming much more diagnosed in adults. And I have many older people presenting saying they finally realize that they do have ADHD, and often they do. Poor concentration, distractibility right through their lives. And sometimes we have to refer people off to be assessed and treated with, sometimes with amphetamines to control the condition. It can be very helpful. But smoking crystal or injecting crystal potentially pretty bad for people because of physical symptoms, relatively high level dependency, quite a lot of cardio. I originally used to think amphetamines was far safer than opiates, but unfortunately you do have quite a lot of heart trouble from amphetamines, and unfortunately psychosis, which can be very problematic, and problems with people forgetting to take their medication, all sorts of things. Unfortunately, with amphetamines, we do not have established drug replacement therapy. There's no methadone currently or equivalent for amphetamines. At St Vincent's, they've done a lot of work on trying to find good drug replacement therapy, but so far it hasn't been terribly successful. So currently, the most useful and widespread approach is cognitive behavioral therapy. And St Vincent's has a very good stimulant treatment program which provides online and face-to-face treatment. And I refer people to the stimulant treatment program at St Vincent's, which you can easily access their contacts online. So now moving on to the drug du jour, medical cannabis. And really, if you go online, there's a remarkable number of people are actually now being prescribed medicinal cannabis in Australia, and maybe up to, well, 700,000 and last year. It's probably closer to 1 million people now who are using medicinal cannabis. It's quite remarkable. I started prescribing medical cannabis about 5 years ago, and there are only about 4 or 5 products. Now there are about 400 products. It can seem very confusing. This is just from the Australian database, looking at what are the main reasons people have been prescribed medicinal cannabis. So number one, not surprisingly, is chronic pain. I think this is still the number one reason. And many of the people I'm prescribing medical cannabis to are actually older people. And I've got some people in their 80s and 90s using medicinal cannabis because it's phenomenally safe. And a lot of older people can't take many other painkillers. So anti-inflammatories can be quite dangerous. Opioids are much more dangerous. And I'm constantly amazed at how helpful quite low doses of medicinal cannabis can be. Also for anxiety, sleep disorder, depression, PTSD, and lots of other things. So when we think about medicinal cannabis, there's really, as probably many people know, there's 2 active drugs. There's tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, which is the most popular part of cannabis, which is the psychoactive component. And this can be very helpful for pain, nausea, cramps, and sleep and appetite. CBD, which is the other main active component, is definitely useful for seizures. In fact, for children, it's on the PBS for certain types of seizures. So it's been very well established. And I've got one patient with epilepsy where it's been extremely helpful. It also seems to have some additional effects on anxiety and possibly pain. There's some doubt about the CBD effect on pain. But we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. So you've got this issue about how much THC, how much CBD do you want in your medicinal cannabis product? And the other key issue is, do you want to go for oral or inhaled? So I guess it's no surprise that inhalation has a rapid onset and is useful for symptoms or that require a quick response. And oral is used for where you want a longer effect. And you can combine, often we do combine an oral with an inhaled. So inhaled really means smoking, but usually with a vaporizer. So we can see that if you just use inhaled by itself, you get quite high peaks and troughs. But if you combine it with say an oral, you then can have a more stable level. So again, just looking at this in a bit of detail, advantages and disadvantages of inhaled or oral. So again, looking at the oils, these are cannabis. One advantage of medicinal cannabis over street cannabis is that, you know, when it says it's 25% THC, it is 25% THC. The interesting thing is they're not, medical cannabis is not a lot cheaper than buying black market cannabis, but you know it's been grown carefully, it doesn't have pesticides in it, and you know the strength of it. I prefer to start people on sort of liquid or oils. These are drops that you just take it, say, if you want to go to sleep, you just take it in the evening, lasts about 6 hours. Good for sleeping and pain, and also it totally bypasses the lung, so that has some advantages. So inhalation is good for short-term use. So with sleep, for instance, if someone has trouble just getting to sleep, inhaled may be better. But if people have trouble with waking up a lot, you're probably better off with a drops or liquid. Or sometimes you use a combination. There's a fair bit of trial and error to get this right. There's a few reasons why you wouldn't use cannabis. If someone has bad heart disease, it's considered a bit risky. Schizophrenia or psychosis is considered a contraindication, but all of these, sometimes you have to make a difficult decision. Of course, it's not safe in pregnancy and lactation, or if you're allergic to cannabis. The number one problem area is driving, because if you use a cannabis product with THC, it will potentially come up as a positive on a roadside drug test. And we have to tell people that, say if you're a big car smash and the police take a sample, it shows cannabis, we can't take responsibility. It's not always a legal defense that you have prescribed it. And this is still a very problematic area, the most problematic area. And the courts, the courts have not decided how to handle this, because we don't have we have a blood alcohol level. We don't have that for cannabis. Also, if someone's doing heavy work with machinery, you have to tell them you can't go to work stoned. So this is the only problematic area, I think. But there are a lot of practical issues. Finding a prescriber and also a pharmacy, you have to go through a consent process. Currently, cannabis is not regarded as a first-line treatment for anything. So we have to define the reason why we're using medical cannabis and in the consent process. Doctors who prescribe a lot of cannabis don't have to apply to the government for each person. But if you're going to a GP that doesn't prescribe it much, they might have to make a special application for you. Then we have to work out the product. Generally, I mostly would use combined THC and CBD together, which is about equal parts. And then the product, such as the drops or the flowers, are smokable. And then start off with a trial and gradually increase it. I often use this, a certain product that costs about $90 for 30 mils. So it's a relatively affordable, and start with that. I'm just going to finish up there, and then we could perhaps have some questions.
Fantastic, David. Thank you. What a thorough talk.